Good evening, everyone. And today we're going to have a very exciting webinar on the right to work of migrant workers, refugees in Malaysia. We have three very exciting speakers here today. And this webinar is brought to you by the Labor Law Reform Coalition. It's a coalition of 58 trade unions and NGOs who have submitted the reforms proposal to the government of Malaysia. So welcome and good evening. And let me take you through the speakers. We have Elise here, Elise Arya Chen, and she's a very efficient, resourceful, and young activist. And she is Tenaganita's program officer and works on the Refugee Action Program. Elise is someone you should keep watch on. She's young, she's full of energy, and at conferences, you can see her shine. So she currently is working with community leaders by supporting refugee-led community-based organizations, such as COBEM, a coalition of Burmese refugee organizations, MEWR or MIRO, a refugee women's group, and REACT, a refugee-led advocacy group. So here we go. I'm going to hand over the mic to Elise. Listen carefully to what she has to say, and you can save your questions for later because we have a time for questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bina. I hope you'll cut me off if I go over the time. I don't think we really had a guideline on what particulars speak, but I think maybe when it comes to refugee realities for anyone who's watching, who's not really familiar with, I think the biggest bulk of the problem when it comes to refugees and work is because of the documentation status. Because Malaysia has not signed on to the 1951 convention, essentially the government here doesn't recognize the definition of refugee that has been set by the United Nations. So a lot of refugees here are deemed as undocumented. Most of them do not have valid travel documents, and because of that, they end up working in more informal sectors. And in our case management in Tenaganita, we see them being exploited a lot more because of this, they're in this gray area. For a lot of them, when they don't get paid their wages and come to us for case management, it becomes quite difficult because employers themselves also know that they're not allowed to employ refugees. And so there's always this attitude of I did them a favor by giving them work, but still decided not to pay. So that becomes a very big challenge for us as well. But it doesn't mean that refugees don't have the right to work, just the same as an undocumented migrant, right? As long as you are a worker in Malaysia, by right, the Labor Department should assist you in your case if you have gone through any sort of labor exploitation. But I think our issue here in Malaysia is even though we have laws and policies that protect the rights of migrants and refugees in some senses, the implementation, the enforcement is not there, especially when you have so many different officers and personnel within these bodies who are actually not really familiar with the differences between a migrant and a refugee, or really the extents to which their services should go when it comes to even supporting undocumented workers. And I think with refugees, another issue that they face, I think like with most of us, right, as in all the local communities, the migrant community and the refugee community alike, was very severely affected by COVID and the movement control order. I think especially so with the refugee because they are employed in the informal sector, a lot of them are in service as well. And they were the first to go. So when they got laid off, there was very little access to justice for them. And we saw exploited by authorities as well. It's not one, for the most part, a lot of policymakers do understand that there is because the Malaysian public is not so familiar with what a refugee is even. I think sometimes for local we've never really been taught through our education system about human rights in general, and also been equipped with the capacity to be more critical thinkers, to think outside of the box and to understand different perspectives, because Malaysians, we haven't really had our human rights exploited to such extreme extents. We've also not gone through war the same way that modern day refugees have gone through. We've never been forced and displaced the same way that refugees do. So when we come across a person like that, we don't even have the capacity to understand. So then we have this defensive thing, right? And internally within Malaysia, we already have so much racial strife. And in my opinion, very politically driven as well, because divide is so easy to put people apart, and then that becomes our natural instinct, right? So when we see a refugee and are unable to understand what really caused them to come into Malaysia, we just turn to the first emotion that we know, which is fear, because we don't understand what is their reality. And it's also, I think, during this COVID time, unfortunately, we saw an increase of xenophobia and racism towards any non-Malaysian here. And I think to some extent we can understand that we want to protect our own country as well. But I think sometimes when we tend to go towards these kind of negative sentiments, we forget the core of Malaysia, which is based on a very diverse population of people of different skill sets and backgrounds. So it's not too absurd for us to actually one day accept refugees and migrants, whether temporary or semi-permanent members of our community as well. I think at the end of the day, we also need to be able to distinguish the difference between a migrant who comes here for economic purposes versus a refugee who comes here for the primary purpose of finding a safe place, because they are dealing with government persecution, they're dealing with violence, extreme discrimination, whether it's from their own governments or from radical groups or others. And they've come into a place like Malaysia just so that they can escape all of this. So their main purpose is just that, right? But in their survival in this host country, they need to work. So at the end of the day, they do need to find some sort of livelihood. I think one of our issues as to why policies have not been implemented, because Malaysians, first of all, don't understand about refugees. They also don't understand how can refugees working actually help our economy and help our local communities. If you think about it, the economy isn't so much so like an equilibrium where if you take something from here, like everything will fall, right? When you give refugees the right to work, you give them a high purchasing power, for example, and now they're able to consume a lot more goods and services. And when they do that, means we need to produce more of that. And so that creates more jobs for Malaysians as well as anyone else in this country. It also spurs the economy a lot better. That kind of assists us all to kind of progress economically. Even the same regard as to education, being able to invest in the education of refugee children here is really important, because like it or not, there will be refugees that come in. And I know that a big rationale that the government often has as to not bring about these policies is because if we do that, then there's going to be an influx coming in. Well, to be honest, the policy surrounding the protection of refugees is nearly non-existent, right? Like we are scapegoating refugees at almost every instant. We are arresting even children and pregnant women and the elderly, the sick. We're putting them into detention centers. We are creating a hell for them right now in Malaysia, but that is still not deterring them from coming into Malaysia, actually. So the population will keep continuing on. So having policies is not necessarily going to increase the population per se, but it's also going to help us manage this issue better, because the so long as we choose to ignore the refugee population, which is very significant at about 170,000 right now that are just registered, we still have a lot of asylum seekers who we don't know whether how much does that number go, right? By ignoring the problem and not having the policies to protect them, to give them the basic human rights to livelihood, to education, to affordable healthcare, it's actually creating a drain on our system and our economy as well. So we need to think much more on a bigger picture. We cannot always just go behind the idea of national security, that because they are not Malaysians, that's why we won't support them. There's a lot more to it. And I think as long as we ignore the problem or treat them as a problem, that will actually create a bigger hole of issues, actually. Um, yeah, is there anything in particular else that you want us to probe on? Still on mute, I think.
Okay, sorry about my mic, but maybe you would like to speak something on the refugees. What happens when they join the informal sector? Also, what do you think um, is the hurdles or the obstacles to regularize and allow refugees to formally work in the formal sector? Because currently, I understand from what you said is that refugees are working only in the informal sector, isn't it? So, what do you think? Because there's only 170,000 registered refugees, as you said. Malaysia, we very often hear that there's a need for a lot of workers, skilled workers. There are industries who still say that there's a shortage and there's a gap. So, what do you think really is the gap, or what prevents the government from allowing refugees the formal work rights?
I think it's difficult just because of the political climate of Malaysia, right? How we've seen so many changes of government and everyone has a very different personality and intention. We have come across a few ministers, a few officers who are very empathetic towards the cause, but it takes a lot more than that. But I think overall, maybe what's stopping the right to work is because Malaysians are not on board with it, or rather if there is a significant number of Malaysians who are supportive of this, they're not voicing this out enough so that our policymakers know about it. Because a lot of times the way that our government functions here is also based on what do the people seem that they want, right? What will they vote for? And when significantly you see a lot more people bashing refugees and supporting them, you wouldn't want to vote the right to work because it would be quite a big mistake if you are threatening the livelihoods of Malaysians at the expense of refugees. And again, like I think it's up to the government as well as civil society who are working with communities to try to build Malaysians' capacity to understand that it's not as simple as that. By giving a refugee the right to work, it's not going to rob you from your livelihood, but it's part of a bigger picture as well. So I think that's the stubbornness that we have, that the voters have, that are kind of rejecting the idea of being able to integrate refugee communities here. And I think it's not just about spurring the economy and investing in them that will help bring us to a better position as well, right? But we need to recognize that the refugee community here is also very, very diverse. We have so many different nationalities coming here, all from different backgrounds or socioeconomic status, some of them with degrees, some of them who are very skilled at farming. Like if you look even at a so-called low-skilled job of farming, right? Like that's one of the most essential traits that we should also respect. Because here in Malaysia, we do have a problem of food security when so many of our farmers are now over the age of 50. Younger people don't want to go into agriculture. But then here you've got a significant population of refugees who've done this really well back home. And actually, a lot of them are also in our plantations right now. So they are making the food that we Malaysians are eating as well. So it's like, how do we utilize this workforce? How do we regularize them in a way that also we can see where the money flows, right? How much of income is not being recorded? How much is going on that we are not being able to put restrictions on or to even regulate? So I think this creates again, that's the ignoring a problem actually makes it a lot more of a problem. I do think that there are some government officers and ministers who are very keen to explore this. But I think it also sometimes needs to be a hand in hand thing. I know for most part, government and NGO, civil society, we've worked kind of like in opposition, or it seems like it. And I definitely do feel the energy as well. Even if we can say something, the energy is different. But I think overall, we all have the same idea in mind. It's not to break each other down. We just really want to make Malaysia a safer place that has integrity, that we can be proud to say that our policies really protect people. I feel like as a Malaysian, that was what I grew up on, right? We were taught to not look at race. Even though, of course, sometimes the reality comes out differently, but that is supposed to be the spirit of what it is to be Malaysian. So why are we not expressing all of these notions throughout everything, especially when it comes to people who are not Malaysian?
Thank you for that. Maybe there's a little more time, perhaps after Liezl's talk, then we would come back to you because I've got a whole load of questions, and I'm sure our listeners and our audience also have a lot of questions on this. That was very interesting indeed, and thank you so much, Elise, um, for that thought-provoking message. And I now, comrades, let me introduce to you Liezl Galdo, someone whom I have worked with, attended a lot of conferences with, someone who's so passionate at what she does that even today, even though she's a panel speaker, she was late because she was handling a call. So, Liezl is a migrant Filipino domestic worker, and she works for the cause of better rights of domestic workers in Malaysia. And these are her words. She says, we organize and educate fellow migrants to help them to know their rights as migrant workers here in Malaysia. We also are partnered with Polo and to conduct, I think this is, I don't know, what is PAOS within 2 years. We leave that to her to explain, but I also know they do a wonderful job of actually doing orientations as well for new domestic workers. And once you speak to Liezl, you will actually know how passionate she is that every domestic worker here should have better rights in Malaysia. Over to you, Liezl.
Thank you, Bina. Yeah, PAOS or PAOS is Post-Arrival Orientation Seminar, which we are partner with Apollo, the Philippine Overseas Labor Office here in Malaysia, way back 2 years ago. So, can I share my screen? Yeah, I think this is the one. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So again, good evening, everyone, and thanks for LLRC to let me speak about the migrant domestic workers in Malaysia. So before going to for our for the team is what is the reality and the ideal work for migrant workers. Before I would proceed to my presentation, I would like everyone to see what really is the work of domestic workers. So domestic workers in the house is a nurse because she's taking care of the kids, taking care of the elderly, and who are like sick in the house. She's taking care of it. A babysitter and a teacher also, because sometimes domestic workers is the one teaching the kids or tutoring the kids about their homeworks, and she's also a chef because she will cook food for the whole family. And of course, she clean the house and she even do repair. Like if the lights of the house is, broken or turned off, she's the one changing. The employer is not calling a technician or electrician to change the light, but it's the worker. It's the domestic workers who do it. And a lot more. So I just mentioned a few, but domestic workers did a lot of jobs inside the house of the employer. Even do the marketing. She's also doing that. So we just see how is the work of the migrant domestic workers inside the house of the employer. So now I'm going through the data. Actually, this data, this chart is from the presentation of the MOHR way back September 2019. So they said that there were 29,980 domestic workers in Malaysia. So from the ILO, they said that there were 300,000 undocumented, but this was from 2004. Migrant domestic workers' contribution to the countries of origin and destinations often not counted. I don't know why it's like that. And also, domestic workers unprotected or were not protected by the laws and policies, because in the Employment Act of Malaysia, domestic workers is not the domestic workers in there. It's a domestic servant. And although hopefully they will amend that, because there's a lot of rumors that they will change it into domestic employee. But so far, it didn't happen yet. And also domestic workers, there's no social security. On the recruitment system, from the recruitment, they were paying placement fees and to the reintegration. So mostly migrant domestic workers were often exploited. First, from the recruitment process that was monopolized by agencies. Way back in the destination countries, they said that the agency was told to the workers that you don't have to pay anything, it's all free. But then later on, when they are already in the country of destination, they already have a salary deductions. They don't know which from where they get the salary deductions, because they didn't borrow money from the agency or from the employer. And then, so they already have the death bondage, and then this illegal recruitment by agencies using a middleman, and also paying the recruitments. In our country, in the Philippines, it says that zero placement fees. But other countries, mostly using the middlemen, like Indonesia, it's really prone on using the middleman. So it's very, very high recruitment fee in there. And a lot more. There's the non-transparency for the employment contract or the substitutions of contract, and also the pre-departure. It's a very very standard, like it's not specific to each countries where the migrant workers going into. And next is the living condition of domestic workers. Some domestic workers, their employees putting a CCTV inside the workers' room. And also just recently, there's a complaint that the workers saying that her employer, when her employer put her in the mother's house to clean there for a month, when she come back, she said that her room had already a CCTV, and even her bathroom, there's also a CCTV in there. So can we call that decent living conditions inside the house of the employer? And the obligations to remain in the household during the rest days. Because mostly they said even our embassies, they said that rest days doesn't mean that you have to go out because you come here to work. But we all know that when the domestic workers stay in the house of the employer, she's not really enjoying like a free time, because as long as you are in the house of the employer, you still have to work. You cannot rest. So in the it happened to check also on the Employment Act. It says there also that rest days, but it says there that it doesn't mean that you have to stay in the house. You are free to use your rest days, whether you stay inside or you have to go out. So I think maybe there's really like a problem on understanding the rest days and days off. And of course, the personal documents like passport. You know that Malaysian has a passport act, but like now it's like a normal, or the implementation of the passport act is not really in there, because the employer is still the one holding the passport of the worker. I will go back to that later on, because it's it's a very I want to emphasize it later on. I will go farther first. So yeah, let's go for the ideal for domestic workers. I think the ideal for domestic workers is to be recognized as a workers, because we already have this ILO C189 recognizing domestic workers as a workers. Like what I present before, all the works that the domestic workers do inside the house of the employer. She's doing everything. She's doing everything, but still, she's not recognized as a workers. Domestic workers as an honorable occupation, just like any other type of employment. But why it's, like, it's disregard as a worker? Like, and even though some domestic workers also, like, they will just accept, like, they are maids, they are helpers, and yeah, we go back to Employment Act, there were domestic servants. Because I think maybe they don't really understand, or they don't really happen to read the ILO C189, the convention, the Domestic Workers Convention. And for the days off, as I mentioned already, versus the rest days, some workers enjoy their day off, but it's not a 24 hours. Some employer, they say, okay, you have to clean first, you have to cook first before you can go out, but you have to come back also around 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon to cook for dinner. And the Employment Act, it says 24 hours straight. But why the employers have to demand the workers to clean first, or do the work first early in the morning on Sundays, and then come back very early in the afternoon? So how many days or how many hours only that the workers is resting? And also legally protected rather than based on piecemeal regulations and policies. Meaning, like, there's really no holistic and comprehensive laws that protect the migrant domestic workers. It's just like because regulations is not really a binding, like it's just a piece of, like maybe can be implemented, or maybe cannot, or maybe the employers can follow or not. They were not obliged to do it because there's no comprehensive laws on that. And about the health rights, like medical reproductive rights, like when the domestic workers go for holidays, or going back home for holidays, of course she has a husband, and when then she come back and it happens that she get pregnant. I really have two sample cases on this. Like when the worker is pregnant, her employers her employer tried to persuade the workers to abort the child, because the employer want this worker to remain working on her house. But of course, this certain lady um, didn't agree with her employer. She refused because it's her first baby. So the employer got very angry because her worker refused. So she give a lot of works to her worker, so that like the worker suffered a pain on her stomach. So that's why she complained. And the employer said, you just come back. I spent a lot of money to you when you go back, and I even gave you your bonus or your 13-month pay. So if you really want to go back, you have to pay it. And I just pay for your renewal. You have to pay it back to me. Like, is it right? Is it like, where is the rights? Where is the reproductive rights of the woman or of the worker? And not to mention like the mental health that's affecting to this worker and also to her baby. And also another case of this reproductive rights, the employer wanted to give injection for her worker before she go back to Philippines to have her vacation. She wanted to give her the injection for her to not get pregnant. This is very inhuman. So that presentation is a part of the reality, but I'm still going to the reality of the domestic workers that experiencing inside the house of the employer. Mostly, the domestic workers often abused and exploited, not just verbal and physical, but also psychological. And not even mentioning the sexual harassment. It's very like, and also again, I mentioned the days off and not compensated for overtime work. When we have this case, like she complained because in our standard contract, it's saying there that domestic workers, their salaries is 1,680. Now the employer just give 1,700, but the worker don't have days off. She's working 24/7, and like 30 30 days a month without, yeah, but only, I mean, like, only compensated for her overtime 20 ringgit, which is in the contract. It says the if the worker will work on during her rest days, the employer should pay her 65 ringgit per day. But for that worker, she works all her days off in her employer's house, but she get only 20 ringgit. Actually, we refer that case to the GTK. And also, salary is often controlled by the employer. Well, some employers give a bank account or open a bank account, but the password or the ATM is withheld by the employer. And also, I'm going back with the passports, withheld by employers, but it's now normalized, like it's like everyday practice. So like when we think, or when the employer think that because often that I heard the reason for the employers to keep the passport of the domestic workers is that to prevent them from running away. They are scared that their domestic workers will run away, but they are not thinking, they're just only keeping the passport of the worker. But are they not thinking that they're leaving their kids with these domestic workers? I mean, like, is it the passport is more important than the kids? Because they leave the kids with these domestic workers. You know, like, how important is the passport? Why these workers going out of the country and just not taking care of her passport? And also, not enough food to eat. Or the workers, when they have chance to go out, they just buy extra food to avoid the hunger. Because the employer is not giving enough food. How their domestic workers work efficiently? When they are not like when they don't have enough food to eat. And also from our embassies, the technical assistance, like passports, because they often say, okay, passport is, it's okay, your employer is keeping it because, you know, like they were scared that you lost your passport and like that. And also for the lack of food, they said, we also eat leftovers. Why you cannot eat leftovers? But it's just not like that. It's just not like that. Often when we reported cases, often the what you call the person that we reported this case, because, you know, the domestic workers will not complain if she's really staying in or if she's really had a good employers, like her food is okay, and the communication, like, because sometimes the worker is just can hold her phones during weekends. We even have encountered a case that the parents, one of the parents of the worker was died. I think her father died, but she just knew it 7 days ago when her father died, because she cannot hold the phone. The employer just give her phone or yeah, give her phone once a week. So she didn't know that her father died. And during the heights of the pandemic, um, the employer also is not giving access to the worker their phones, and that they cannot contact their family in the Philippines, or in the country of origin, because it's not just happened to Filipino, but also it happens mostly of the migrant domestic workers here in Malaysia. So with that, for our recommendations is to recognize domestic workers as a worker, and of course to amend the Employment Act, and also let the migrant domestic workers join, or to build their own unions, and also for SOCSO must be applicable to all migrant workers, regardless with the sectors and nationality. And minimum wage should apply for all workers, including migrant domestic workers. And for the domestic workers bill should be adopted by the International Convention 189, and also ratify the C189. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liezl. You really opened our eyes to, we knew a lot of things goes on, but you have articulated it so well. We can see, how your your need is there to bring about change. And we do hope the government of Malaysia really uh, hears the voice, because definitely domestic workers need protection. They are so isolated from in their homes. What access to justice do they have, and how do domestic workers actually reach out? Are there hotlines for them to reach out in times of difficulties, or when they are in abuse situations? Do you give them a number? Is there a number they can call? How responsive is the embassy to their situation? Will you be able? Am I putting you in a spot, or will you answer that?
Yeah, the embassies is, like, although when we refer these cases, that's why I have mentioned that uh, often the responses is like, we cannot really feel that they favor the worker. Only when we really see, because one time we have a case, like we follow up this case to our embassies, and she said the workers has already gone back. I said no, she's still here. That's why she kept on complaining, because her visa is already expired, and her employer didn't send her back home, because the employer said that there's no flight. But this worker, she already know that there's a flight, because her friend already go back. And also the agency sent the embassy the ticket of the worker that said that she's already gone back. And when we really push to the embassy that no, she didn't go back, she's still here, and Shirley wanted to go back. So like, you really have to push them to assert these certain cases.
Um, I know you have a briefing and an orientation for the domestic workers when they come in, to let them know their rights. It looks like employers don't know actually what are they allowed. what is permissible, how much of work is enough, don't they have, what are the hours of work they can allow, they are allowed to work, what are the rest days, what are the rest hours that a domestic worker should have. I think, um, you know he, it is the employers who need the briefing more, on how to take care of their um, domestic workers. What are the rights of domestic workers? How much is allowed? And that is not happening, because we see them time and again doing multiple jobs, multiple tasks, not getting enough of rest, not, like you said, not getting enough of food as well, and being, in the same under the same roof, not able to go out, actually keeps them so isolated. So when it comes to abuse, some of them, I think even the domestic workers don't know that, they are being abused. Yeah. So it's really important that they have that day off. It's really important that their hours of work are regularized. It really is important that they have access to justice, they have their passports, and a line where they can communicate to someone in case there's trouble. And somebody has to also, what are the agents? Tell me about the agents. Does the if the domestic worker complains to the agent saying that, hey, I'm being made to work like 20 hours of the day. I'm being made to work 16 hours of the day. It's hard work. I'm not getting enough of food. Tell me, what does the agent do then? What is the role of the agent?
Yeah, actually, the agent is the very first perpetrator, may I say, because when the worker arrives, she go first to the agency, and then the agency brief the employer that don't give her cell phones, don't give her a day off. Although uh, not all agencies is doing like this, but mostly the agencies is doing like this. And when the worker complained, like I also example one case when the domestic worker complained because her employer is keep on saying nasty words, like like most of the time call her stupid, and she was not used to it. That's why she complained to the to the agency. But the agency is, like just close her ears and not listening until such time that the workers cannot really stand the verbal abuse. Although her employer didn't do physical abuse, but verbal abuse is worst, because it will lead to psychological problem for the workers. So it ends on she ran away because of the agency is not paying attention. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. But I'm going to ask Sumita now. She's quite an expert on labor laws. She's quite an expert, and she's been working for so many years on migrant work. So I'm going to ask Sumita to come in, step in, and tell us how can we better protect um, um, domestic workers. Sumita,
Sorry, I didn't realize I was going to be called.
I'm sorry to put you in the
Domestic
spot.
workers, I mean, like what Liezl said, definitely we need an act. There was a time when the government was proposing a regulation that was, compared to an act, it would be a simpler way to regulate domestic work. But then the problem was the draft that the government gave was not satisfactory. So then when, of course, when the PH government came, then there was a lot of lobby to have the Domestic Worker Act. But unfortunately, before we could see the fruition of that, then, the government fell. So that is definitely something that we have to continue pushing for, a Domestic Workers Act. Secondly, definitely the regulation of agents, because compared to the migrant workers, the domestic worker agents fees and I think their monitoring of them is not as good, or rather is not satisfactory. So we have a lot of agents here itself, Malaysian agents, who are the agents who are bringing in the domestic workers. So there is a lot of associations for them, but then that it's not compulsory for them to be members of that particular association. So the regulation still comes under the Ministry of Human Resources, but unfortunately, again, the monitoring, the enforcement then becomes a problem. In terms of the criteria for a person to employ a domestic worker also needs to be looked at. Just the fact that you can earn more than 3,000 ringgit and you have children and aged parents, you can already employ a domestic worker. But I think it has to go beyond that. And we have always been asking for that the employer themselves go for an orientation before their application is approved. So that they need to go through the orientation, know what are the laws, know the rights, the obligations, and then give them the approval. Then I think we could see, we can filter the people who are actually eligible for domestic workers. So these are some of the things that the government has to put on hold. And also in terms of the salaries that the workers get, the domestic workers get, unfortunately it's based on market value, and is also based on bilateral agreements between the countries. So for instance, Filipinos can get 1680 at present, but then Indonesian will only get 800. So the law on minimum wage specifically excludes domestic workers. It says that the minimum wage shall not apply to the domestic worker. But I think what we must advocate is that the salaries should be nothing less than the minimum wage. So it covers Filipinos who are getting 1680, but we also ensure that a domestic worker will not get a salary below the minimum wage. Okay, so these are some of the things that we should look out for. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumita. That was really so well said, and you explained it very well. What are the recommendations for um, uh, domestic workers? Liezl, do you have anything to add? Are you okay?
I think I'm okay. I've mentioned a lot. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Elise. Uh, so what happens to refugees who don't receive their wages, um, who have employment disputes, and what access of justice do they have? Is it same as a Malaysian worker? Because they are working in the informal sector. So how do they resolve employment disputes for refugees? Is there a hotline, that they can call?
I think with the refugee community, depending on the communities they come from, some of them have been here much longer, such as the Burmese, compared to, say, the Middle Eastern and North African refugees. So the amount of time they've spent here, they've also used that to organize themselves into community-based organizations, which usually serve to assist their community members with issues such as this. So some of them who have been engaged with a lot of civil society who works on labor issues have gone through training on how to document cases well and where are the avenues of justice that they can explore. Similar to like how Tenaganita does it, a lot of community organizations and leaders would act as mediators to go in and get all the facts of the case and have a conversation between the worker and the employer to find out what are the real facts of the case and how can a compromise come together. But when it comes to, I think, the actual legal rights, by right, a refugee should be supported by JTK, the Labour Department, if they have the evidence to prove that they have been working for this person. JTK is not in charge of deciding who who goes into the detention center because of documentation purpose. It is there to protect the workers, and it's not just to say that because it's in the name, right? But we have had court cases that show we have had a case of a refugee, a UNHCR card holder who does not have a passport, who went into court to file for unpaid wages and actually won. We also have the case of Nurna, who is also an undocumented migrant, and also that rule that JTK should actually assist a worker as long as they can be proven that they are a worker. So the avenues of justice is there. Again, some of the points that I said earlier, I think the problem is just you have a lot of officers who are not aware of these. And then at the same time, coupled with employers who know very well that they shouldn't be employing refugees, and that refugees can get into trouble for not having documentation. And a lot of times, if you bring both, even though the employer can be charged with harboring an undocumented person and hiring an illegal worker, oftentimes you see the discrepancy where justice leans over whether it's for the Malaysian employer or whether it's for the refugees. But overall, yes, aside from community-based organizations, there are a lot of us civil society organizations who does case management. We can also assist these refugee communities in mediating the case as well. If not, then to bring it to JTK.
Thank you. I also understand that there are a lot of women refugees who are working in the retail sector and the informal sector. How are they safeguarded from against abuse and sexual harassment? Basically, because uh, they are working informally. Do you get many cases of
I think
women
it's
workers?
difficult to on that case because if you look at a lot of the refugee communities, they also come from cultures that don't talk so much about gender equality and with women empowerment, right? Similar to here in Malaysia, our struggles of getting sexual harassment to be a topic that we talk about openly and we address. A lot of these refugees also have that similar approach to any form of sexual and gender-based violence. So when it comes to harassment at the workplace, it is very common, but we don't have statistics on it because they also come from a perspective where it is also kind of shameful. It is we often look at the victim and say, oh, what were you wearing? And did you ask for it? Or then also, I think a lot of women would just accept it as this is part and parcel of that. But I think they face an additional vulnerability like any women worker, regardless of whether Malaysian or migrant, documented or undocumented, we face that risk, right, of harassment, of any form of sexual and gender-based violence wherever we go, whether it's at home or outside or at the workplace. But with refugees, I think it's even more so because if a person knows that this one is a refugee and understand the basic part of it, and the most general fact is that this person is undocumented. So if I were to do something to her, she'll be very fearful of going into a police station to report against me. So we have cases, and unfortunately, we don't have formal cases filed with us, again, because it goes back to that culture of women just not being empowered enough to speak up. That is so normalized to be, it's not a matter of if, right, it's always a matter of when will a woman get sexually assaulted or harassed or face any form of this. So I think it's the additional vulnerabilities that people notice in refugee women and girls as well, that they become an easy target.
Um, Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so many studies have shown that if refugees have the right to work, they can take care of themselves, they can take care of the education of their children, their families. They are empowered to do better. But yet we see so much of hesitation to give refugees the formal right to work. Um, Similarly, women are so vulnerable when they don't have their livelihood, and it would augur well again to empower women for refugees. After all, the numbers we are seeing is 170,000. We've heard from countries like Jordan, Ecuador, Turkey that have larger number of refugees, and they've given them rights, and it seems to work well for them because the refugees are able to take care of themselves and educate their own children and healthcare, provide for their healthcare. they are less dependent on others when they have the formal rights to work. And we really hope that the government of Malaysia as well, listens to the voices of the activists and know that other countries as well have had very large successes when it came to refugee work rights. There are no floodgates where people are going to rush in like that. Yeah, um, the moment that we give refugees the right to work. We also hope that, just rounding up a bit of what Sumita said, that salaries should exceed minimum wage for domestic workers. And it is good that the government of Philippines was able to actually have negotiate a good wage for the Philippine domestic workers, so they have a higher rate than the Indonesian or the other nationalities. Also, the regulation of agents, that seems to be really very important for domestic workers. Uh, and also, they need to be monitored, right? And the ratification of the ILO convention, the C189, is again very important for domestic workers. So before we end, I'm going to ask, are there any before we end, I would like to find out if there are any of you who would like to speak up. I think I can see Shanti. Maybe she wants to say something because she's trying to connect with her audio. Shanti, are you trying to say something? Would you like to share something? Is there anybody in the group here who would like to share something on the issue? Um, I'm going to ask both Liezl as well as Elise, any last words? What are your recommendations you have for the government of Malaysia on the issue of having an ideal policy for the right to work of migrant workers and domestic workers? So over to you, Elise first, and then Liezl. What would your recommendations be to the government of Malaysia?
I think we want to push. So in change, we have put in a policy paper to the current Minister of Human Resource already about our proposal for work rights. But overall, we want we don't want to ask for too much first. But at the very least, if the government of Malaysia is wary about signing on to the 1951 convention for their own reasons, at least we need to have policies within the country then, have your own definition. If you want to have cards of documenting and recording about the refugee population, you need to also give them something. You cannot collect data and charge them so much money for cards without also supporting them in some way. And you don't have to give handouts. We don't want to create communities of dependence, but in that regard, then you need to give them their basic human rights, which is the right to work, the right to healthcare, and the right to education. And that falls under the umbrella of just finding a way to give them proper documentation. We want to explore something that we already have, such as the IMM 13. It has its flaws. We have identified some of its shortcomings, and we are very happy to engage with the government. I think we cannot work without one another. We notice that there have been government bodies who have the initiative and the intention to assist this community, but I think they also lack the access to the communities the way that we have. So we are always very happy to connect the two. We want to not dominate the spaces as NGOs and civil society. We want to help support the refugee community leaders and representatives to go and speak to these policymakers themselves so that they can hear the stories and they can actually engage properly together to get the fuller picture and to have the most efficient policies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Elise. It was, you opened up our eyes to a lot of things on refugees. You've spoken so well on the issue, and we really hope that, there will be some changes. I understand when you say that you don't want to ask too much, but just asking for formal work rights is going to help. Yeah, so we're also looking forward to that. and we hope the government is going to be receptive to the reforms that has been asked by LLRC as well. So, Liezl, any last words? Would you like to share something with us? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, I have mentioned my recommendations again, but I would like to say it again. So, our recommendation is for the government to recognize domestic workers as workers and also ratify the Convention 189, domestic work is work, and also the Convention 190. Um, uh, Convention 190 is no, I forget. Sorry. Um, Convention 190 is uh, ending the harassment and ending the violence and harassment in the world of work. So yeah, hopefully the government will ratify those conventions.
Okay, thank you. Does the audience have any more questions? I don't see any hands raised up or any questions. So I want to thank all of you here for being here. Thank you to LLRC, the Labor Law Reform Coalition, for organizing this webinar. It's been wonderful. I really don't know how time went by. And our third speaker, I don't know what happened to him, so we'll probably listen to him in another time. So thank you to our two speakers, Elise and Liezl. You've been really wonderful. And we just hope that there will be better rights for domestic workers as well. There'll be the contracts that can be enforced. I hope we will see it in our lifetime, right? So thank you, LLRC, again. Thank you, Liezl. Thank you to the audience. Have a very good evening then. Good night.